Blood tastes like old pennies and regret. When my escape pod slammed into the mud of Kepler's forgotten sister planet, I expected to die alone, choked by ammonia clouds. I didn't expect hands, dozens of them, calloused, frantic, tearing at my flight suit with a hunger that made the native apex predators look tame. They hadn't seen a man in over a century, and in their desperate, violent need to claim me, they almost ripped me down to the bone. My skull throbbed in time with the blinking red emergency light. Each pulse sent a hot, sharp ache behind my eyes. I was hanging upside down, held by the restraining straps of my pilot seat, surrounded by the acrid stench of electrical fires and vaporized coolant. I swallowed, tasting ash. The ship, or what was left of the forward scout vessel Reliant, groaned around me. Metal cooling, contracting, dying. Unbuckling was a mistake. I hit the ceiling, now the floor, hard, my left shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. A sharp gasp tore out of my throat. It didn't sound heroic. It sounded pathetic, small, like a cornered animal. I lay there for a minute, pressing my face against the cold, warped composite flooring. The silence outside the hull was heavier than the gravity. It pressed against my eardrums, thick and suffocating. I dragged myself toward the manual release lever for the primary hatch. My hands were shaking, slippery with sweat, and something darker that I didn't want to look at too closely. Pulling the lever required every ounce of leverage I could muster. It gave way with a rusted shriek, and the hatch blew outward. Air rushed in. It wasn't the sterile, recycled oxygen of the ship, nor the toxic soup the sensors had originally warned about. It smelled of rotting vegetation, wet iron, and ozone. I crawled out into the mud. The sky above was a bruised purple, heavy with clouds that looked like they hadn't broken in a decade. Surrounding my crashed pod was a forest of towering skeletal trees with black bark and pale weeping leaves. The ground was essentially a swamp of gray clay. I sat against the scorched hole of my pod, wiping grime from my face. I was Arthur. I was a junior orbital engineer. I fixed comms relays. I wasn't supposed to be here. I was supposed to be asleep in cryo, bound for a corporate hub world, not stranded in the ass end of an uncharted sector because our navigation array threw a fatal exception. I checked my survival belt. The emergency beacon was smashed. The rations were buried in the flaming wreckage. I laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound. Cynicism was a comfortable blanket when you knew you were going to die. I gave myself maybe 2 days before the thirst got me, or whatever lived in those black trees decided I was protein. Then a twig snapped. It wasn't a subtle sound. It was sharp, deliberate. I froze, my hand dropping to the heavy-duty hydrospanner hanging from my belt, my only makeshift weapon. I held my breath. The wind shifted, bringing a new scent. Sweat, tanned leather, ash. Shadows moved between the trees. They were fast, low to the ground. Predators. I tightened my grip on the heavy tool, my knuckles turning white. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Step out," I croaked, my voice rough and cracking. "I'm armed." A lie, obviously. A hydrospanner wasn't going to stop a pack of native wolves, but the shadows didn't belong to wolves. Someone stepped into the clearing. She was tall, taller than me, maybe 6'2", with shoulders broad and corded with lean, dense muscle. She wore armor crafted from scavenged metal plates and dark, scaly hides. Her face was smeared with gray mud, but beneath it, her skin was pale, weathered, and scarred. Ice blue eyes locked onto mine, widening so drastically I could see the whites all the way around her irises. She didn't look like an alien. She looked human, a feral, deeply dangerous human. She inhaled sharply, a ragged, hitching sound. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. Instead, she let out a low, warbling whistle. In seconds, the tree line erupted. They poured into the clearing. 10, 20, 30 of them, all women, all clad in the same patchwork armor of survival and violence. Some had hair hacked short with blades. Others wore it in long, matted dreadlocks. They carried spears tipped with jagged glass, heavy iron clubs, and scavenged kinetic rifles that looked barely functional. But none of them were looking at my ship. None of them were looking at my supplies. They were staring at me. The silence that fell over the clearing was terrifying. It wasn't the silence of predators assessing prey. It was the silence of religious zealots witnessing a miracle. "A male," one of them whispered. The common tongue was warped, thick with a strange guttural accent, but I understood it. By the blood, a male. I took a step back, my boots sinking into the mud. "Listen," I started, raising my hands in what I hoped was a placating gesture. "I just crashed. I don't want any trouble. I didn't get to finish." The first woman lunged. She didn't attack with a weapon. She dropped her spear and slammed into me with the force of a freight train. We hit the mud hard. I yelled, trying to push her off, but her grip was like a vice. Her hands clawed at my chest, ripping the heavy fabric of my flight suit. "Mine!" she shrieked, her face inches from mine, her breath smelling of raw meat and copper. "Get off!" I choked out, swinging the spanner. But then the rest of them hit us. It was a tidal wave of bodies, limbs, and desperate animalistic shrieks. I was buried under a pile of frantic women. Hands grabbed my arms, my legs, my hair. They were pulling me in opposite directions. A heavy boot caught me in the ribs, knocking the wind out of me. Nails dug into my shoulders. "I saw him first," a voice roared. "He's for the clan," another screamed, punching the woman on top of me. Blood sprayed across my cheek. They were tearing each other apart, and I was the rope in their tug of war. The sheer physical pressure of their bodies was crushing the breath out of me. My jacket ripped down the seam. A hand closed around my throat, not to strangle, but to drag. I was suffocating under their desperation. The smell of dirt, sweat, and blood overwhelmed me. My vision started to swim. I was going to be dismembered, ripped to pieces by starving ghosts who hadn't seen a man in over a century. I closed my eyes, waiting for the crack of my own bones. Mud filled my mouth as a heavy strike cracked across my jaw. It wasn't aimed at me, just collateral damage in the violent frenzy unfolding on top of my chest. I spat out a mixture of clay and blood, gasping for a breath that wouldn't come. Above me, a woman with a jagged scar across her nose was strangling the one who had tackled me first. "Back off, you feral bitch!" the scarred one screamed, slamming a mailed fist into the other's cheekbone. The weight shifted, and for a split second, I saw the gray sky again. I didn't waste it. I kicked out hard, my boot connecting with a solid thigh, and scrambled backward through the sludge. My flight suit was in tatters, the insulated lining spilling out like guts. I scrambled on my hands and knees, desperate to put distance between myself and the chaotic mass of screaming women, but I didn't get far. A hand clamped down on my ankle. The grip was absurdly strong, fingers digging into my Achilles tendon through the thick leather of my boot. I was yanked backward, my chin slamming into the mud. "He breathes," a deep, rasping voice muttered right above me. I was hoisted up by the collar of my torn suit. Two women, each easily outweighing me in sheer muscle mass, gripped my arms, hauling me to my feet. My shoulders screamed in protest. I dangled between them, toes barely scraping the earth. Then the fighting stopped. It didn't just taper off. It ceased instantly, cut down by a single booming sound. A heavy iron staff slammed into the side of my burning pod. The metallic clang echoed through the damp forest, ringing in my ears. The women who were still rolling in the mud froze. They scrambled to their feet, wiping blood from their faces, and lowered their heads. The crowd parted. She walked with a pronounced limp, dragging a heavy braced leg through the clay, but no one looked at her with anything resembling pity. She was older than the rest, her dark hair streaked with iron gray, her face a map of deep lines and violent history. She wore a heavy coat made of patched leather and kinetic mesh, a rusted officer's insignia pinned near her collar. She stopped 3 feet from me. The smell of her was sharp. Campfires, antiseptic, and old sweat. "Drop him," she ordered. The two women holding me let go immediately. I collapsed, landing hard on my bad shoulder, biting my tongue to keep from crying out. The older woman crouched. Her knees popped loudly. She reached out, her fingers thick and scarred, and grabbed my chin. She forced my head up, turning my face side to side, inspecting me like a piece of livestock at a desperate auction. Her thumb wiped a smear of blood from my cheek. Her skin felt like sandpaper. "A male," she said, her voice dropping into a low, gravelly register. "Flesh and blood, not a gene vault projection, not a corporate trick." "Who?" I coughed, spitting more mud. "Who are you?" She ignored my question. She looked at my torn flight suit, at the corporate logo patched on the breast. "You fell from the sky." "My ship crashed," I managed to say, trying to pull my chin from her grip. She didn't let go. "I'm an engineer. Arthur, let me go." She finally released me, standing up to address the circle of violently expectant women. "I am Morgan," she announced, though it seemed more for my benefit than theirs. She pointed the end of her iron staff at me. 113 years. That is how long the isolation protocols have kept this colony in the dark. Our great-grandmothers watched the last of the men die of the rust blight. We have survived on frozen genetic stock, splicing, and luck. And the stock ran dry 3 winters ago. She looked back down at me. The hunger in her eyes wasn't the mindless, tearing frenzy of the younger women. It was cold, calculating, deeply terrifying. "We are a dying tribe, Arthur," Morgan said, rolling my name around in her mouth like a strange delicacy. "And you just fell into our laps." "I'm not a savior," I shot back, forcing myself up onto my knees. My ribs ached with every breath. "I don't have supplies. My comms are dead. I can't get you off this rock." A young woman with chopped blonde hair and a bleeding lip stepped forward. "We don't want off this rock," she snarled. "We want life. We want a future." "Quiet, Chloe," Morgan snapped, without looking away from me. "He does not understand yet. He looks at us and sees monsters." "I see people who just tried to tear my arms off," I fired back, fear making me reckless. Morgan let out a short, barking laugh. You smell like fear and sterile metal. You come from a soft world. You do not understand what it means to watch your family line end because the incubators fail and the gene banks turn to sludge." She leaned down again, bringing her face uncomfortably close to mine. "They attacked you because you are water in a desert. You are the only future this tribe has." The reality of the situation crashed over me, colder and heavier than the mud I was kneeling in. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't a stranded pilot to be rescued. I was a biological resource. I was the last man on a planet of desperate warrior women. "Bind his hands," Morgan commanded, turning her back on me. "Gently. If anyone breaks a bone, I will take their eyes." Chloe and another woman stepped forward, carrying thick ropes woven from vines and wire. I didn't fight them. I was exhausted, battered, and unarmed. As they tied my wrists, pulling the bindings tight enough to chafe but not cut circulation, I looked around at the circle of faces. They weren't looking at me with malice. That was the worst part. They looked at me with reverence, with a terrifying, consuming possessiveness. "Walk," Chloe muttered, shoving me lightly between the shoulder blades. We marched away from the smoldering wreckage of my pod, leaving my old life to burn in the gray mud. The trek through the forest was brutal. The humidity clung to me like a wet blanket, and insects the size of my fist buzzed in the heavy air. We walked for hours. My boots grew heavy, my breath ragged. No one spoke, but I could feel their eyes on my back, on my neck, tracking my every movement. By the time the smells of wood smoke and roasting meat cut through the stench of the swamp, I was running on fumes. We crested a ridge, and the settlement spread out before us. It was a brutalist shanty town built into the ruins of an old corporate terraforming facility. Rusted metal walls met tanned hides and spiked barricades. As we walked through the gates, hundreds of faces turned toward us. The noise of the camp died instantly. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. I looked at Morgan, walking ahead of me. I looked at the hundreds of starving, desperate eyes locked onto my every step. I was alive, yes. But survival, I was quickly learning, was going to be a lot more complicated than I ever imagined. Ash crunched beneath my boots. That was the first thing that grounded me as we passed through the rusted, towering gates of the settlement. The ground wasn't mud here. It was compacted gray dirt mixed with generations of pulverized fire pit ash and rusted screws. The smell hit me next, a suffocating blend of boiling root vegetables, raw sewage, and the metallic tang of ozone leaking from exposed, dying power lines overhead. Hundreds of eyes tracked my march. Women lined the narrow, winding pathways of the shanty town. Some stood on the corrugated roofs of half-collapsed terraforming habitats, their silhouettes dark against the bruised sky. Others pressed against chain-link fences, their fingers hooked through the metal diamonds. Nobody spoke. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic squeak of Morgan's knee brace and my own ragged breathing. I looked at the faces passing by. I expected to see monsters, given how they had attacked me in the forest. Instead, I saw exhaustion. Deep, generational exhaustion. I saw sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, and skin stained yellow by whatever heavy metals were leaching into their water supply. I saw a little girl, maybe 3 years old, clutching the frayed hem of her mother's leather tunic. The child sucked on 2 dirty fingers, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Morgan's words echoed in my skull. The stock ran dry 3 winters ago. That little girl was one of the last, the absolute end of the line. My stomach twisted into a cold, tight knot. I wasn't just a prisoner. I was the terrifying weight of their entire species' survival dropped right onto my aching shoulders. Morgan led me to a large, blocky structure near the center of the camp. It was one of the few buildings still largely intact, painted with the faded, peeling remains of a medical cross. 2 women stood guard at the heavy steel door, armed with kinetic rifles that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in a decade. They didn't salute Morgan, but they stepped aside instantly, their eyes locked on my chest. "Inside," Morgan grunted, pushing the door open. The air inside was stale, smelling strongly of dried iodine and old sweat. It was a makeshift triage center. Rusty cots lined the walls, most of them empty. At the far end of the room, washing blood off her hands in an aluminum basin, was a woman. She looked up as we entered. She was younger than Morgan, but lacked the feral, hungry edge of the forest hunters. Her dark hair was tied back in a severe bun, and thick, round goggles rested around her neck. Her apron was stained brown with old fluids. "Sadie," Morgan said, her voice dropping some of its authoritative bark. "Fix him. Do not let anyone else in here. If Chloe's crew tries to breach the clinic, shoot them in the legs." Sadie wiped her hands on a ragged towel, her gaze drifting over my battered form. "Is it true?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a scratch in the quiet room. "He fell from the sky," Morgan replied, curtly. She turned to me, her ice blue eyes narrowing. "Do not try to run, Arthur. There is nowhere to go, and the swamp will digest you before the sun sets. Sadie will patch you up." Morgan turned and limped out, the heavy steel door slamming shut behind her. The lock engaged with a loud, final clunk. I stood there, swaying slightly, my bound wrists resting against my stomach. My left shoulder was throbbing with a dull, sickening heat, and my ribs felt like shattered glass every time I drew a breath. Sadie approached me slowly, like I was a wild animal that might snap. She stopped 2 feet away, simply staring. Her eyes tracked the line of my jaw, the stubble on my chin, the broadness of my chest beneath the torn flight suit. Her hands were shaking. I need you to sit," she finally managed, pointing to a metal exam table under a flickering fluorescent tube. I shuffled over and sat, wincing as my bruised tailbone made contact with the cold steel. "Can you take these off?" I asked, holding up my bound wrists. My voice sounded weak, pathetic. Sadie hesitated, glancing at the locked door, then pulled a small curved blade from her belt. She stepped in close. She smelled like rubbing alcohol and crushed mint. The blade slipped under the vine rope, and with a quick flick, the pressure vanished. I rubbed my wrists, the skin beneath raw and bleeding. "Your suit," she said softly. "Take it off. I need to see the damage." I didn't argue. My fingers fumbled clumsily with the broken zipper. It was humiliating, struggling out of my ruined gear under her intense, unwavering stare. When I finally stripped the top half down, leaving me bare-chested in the freezing room, Sadie let out a sharp breath. I looked down. My torso was a canvas of purple and black bruises. Mud and dried blood caked my pale skin. She reached out, her rough, calloused fingers making contact with my collarbone. I flinched, not from pain, but from the electric shock of the touch. She wasn't just examining me, she was feeling the reality of me. Her thumb brushed over my pulse point at the base of my neck. "Your skin is so thin," she murmured, tracing a bruised rib. and you are so warm." "I'm human," I rasped, leaning back slightly to break the contact. "Just a guy." "Please, my shoulder." Sadie snapped out of her trance, her medical training overriding her awe. "Right, sorry, lean forward." She moved behind me. Her hands gripped my left arm and the top of my shoulder. "Take a deep breath on 3, 1, 2. She didn't wait for 3. She yanked. A sickening pop echoed in the room, followed by a blinding flash of white agony that forced a strangled scream out of my throat. My vision went dark at the edges. I slumped forward, gasping, sweat breaking out across my forehead. "It was dislocated," Sadie said, matter-of-factly, moving to a cabinet to fetch a roll of dirty bandages. "You will live." "Thanks for the warning," I wheezed, spitting bile back down my throat. As she began to tightly wrap my ribs, restricting my breathing even further, I looked around the room. I saw rusty scalpels, empty gene vault canisters used as water jugs, and a heavy iron chain bolted to the leg of the exam table. They were going to keep me alive. But looking at that chain, I realized survival was going to be a very subjective term. Night fell like a heavy iron lid slamming shut over the colony. The temperature plummeted, turning the damp, humid air into a biting chill that seeped straight into my bones. Sadie had left me alone hours ago, locking the clinic's inner door behind her. I was sitting on a thin, lumpy mattress in the corner of what used to be a quarantine cell, staring at the concrete floor. My mind was running terrifying permutations. I was a junior orbital engineer. My job was calibrating satellite telemetry, not navigating the violent socio-politics of an isolated matriarchy. Every scenario I played out in my head ended with me strapped to a table, drained of everything that made me human until I was a hollow husk. The heavy outer door clanged open, pulling me out of my downward spiral. Heavy, irregular footsteps approached. Morgan unlocked the inner cell door and stepped inside. She carried a dented metal tray. The smell that wafted off it hit my brain like a physical blow. Roasted meat, charred root vegetables, and something that smelled faintly of garlic. My stomach cramped violently, reminding me I hadn't eaten in over 30 hours. She set the tray on the floor near my feet, then pulled a folding metal chair from the corner and sat. The chair groaned under her weight. "Eat," she commanded. I didn't need to be told twice. I dropped to my knees and tore into the meat. It was greasy, tough, and tasted vaguely of sulfur, but it was the best thing I had ever eaten in my life. I shoveled the roots into my mouth, barely chewing, grease running down my chin. Morgan watched me in silence until I slowed down, breathing heavily over the half-empty tray. "Slowly, or you will vomit," she said, pulling a canteen from her belt and tossing it to me. Water, boiled. I drank, the warm liquid soothing my raw throat. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, leaning against the cold concrete wall. "Why am I in a cage, Morgan?" "To keep you breathing," she replied, her face shadowed in the dim, flickering light of a single chemical glow stick hanging from the ceiling. "You saw the hunters in the forest. You saw Chloe. They do not think of tomorrow. They only think of the hunger. They wanted to rip me apart. They wanted to claim you," Morgan corrected, her voice deadpan. "In our law, the one who claims the male owns the lineage. They would have dragged you to their tents, and then the other factions would have slaughtered them to take you. You would have been torn to pieces in the crossfire." I shuddered. the memory of those desperate clawing hands still fresh on my skin. "So what happens now? You just keep me locked up here? A town pet?" Morgan leaned forward, resting her forearms on her knees. The leather of her coat creaked. "The mothers, the older generation, listen to me. We understand logistics. We understand that a single man cannot serve a settlement of 400 overnight without dying of exhaustion. We need a system, a rotation." The clinical, detached way she spoke about my body made my skin crawl. "I'm not a machine," I snapped, my voice shaking despite my attempt to sound firm. "I'm a person." "You are a resource," Morgan shot back, her tone hardening. "Do not mistake my protection for compassion, Arthur. My people are going extinct. The gene vaults failed decades ago. We've been scraping by on degraded stock, and now even that is gone. I will do whatever it takes to ensure the next generation is born. If that means chaining you to a bed for the rest of your natural life, I will do it without a second thought." Panic spiked in my chest, hot and suffocating. I needed leverage. I needed to be more than just biology to her. My eyes darted around the room, landing on the flickering fluorescent tube out in the hall, listening to the strained, uneven hum vibrating through the floorboards. "Your grid is failing," I blurted out. Morgan blinked, clearly derailed by the sudden shift in topic. "What?" "The power," I said, pointing upward. "The lights flicker in a rhythmic pattern. The hum in the floor. It's uneven. You're running on hydroturbines, probably pulling from the river I saw on my descent. But the main bearing in your primary turbine is shot. It's grinding. I can hear the micro stutters from here." Morgan stared at me, her jaw tight. "Our mechanics do what they can. Your mechanics are patching ancient tech with scrap," I countered, sitting up straighter, ignoring the stabbing pain in my ribs. "If that bearing seizes, it'll tear the turbine apart. You'll lose your main power source. No power means no refrigeration for whatever medicine Sadie has left. No perimeter defenses. You'll be living in the dark." "And?" Morgan challenged. "And I'm an engineer," I said, locking eyes with her. "I build orbital arrays. Fixing a rusted hydroturbine is child's play for me. I can stabilize your grid. I can fix your comms. I can make this place run better than it has in a century." Morgan didn't speak. She just watched me, her pale eyes searching my face for a lie. "I'm not a breeding stud, Morgan," I whispered, leaning forward. "Let me work. Let me fix the camp. I'll earn my keep. Just don't hand me over to them." The silence stretched, heavy and thick. Outside, the wind howled through the rusted, corrugated walls of the settlement. Finally, Morgan stood up. She picked up the empty tray. "Tomorrow, you will look at the turbine," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. "But do not mistake your usefulness for freedom, Arthur. A wrench in your hand does not change what you carry in your blood. You belong to the tribe now." She walked out, the heavy steel door slamming shut, plunging me back into the terrifying, vibrating silence of my cage. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a creeping, damp grayness that bled through the frosted skylight of my cell. My breath bloomed in thin white clouds. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest as I forced myself off the lumpy mattress. My left shoulder was a knot of white-hot agony radiating down to my fingertips. Sadie's bandages held my ribs tight, but it felt like breathing through a corset made of barbed wire. Morgan did not come for me. Instead, the heavy steel door swung open to reveal two women I hadn't seen before. They wore heavy canvas overalls, stained black with decades of synthetic grease. One was tall, missing her left ear, the scarred tissue sloping smoothly into her jawline. The other was shorter, built like a brick wall, carrying a heavy canvas tool bag over her shoulder. They didn't look at me with the same rabid, tearing hunger of the forest hunters, but their eyes were wide, tracking my every twitch. "I am Harper," the taller one said, her voice gruff and unaccustomed to polite introduction. "Morgan says you know the machines. Show us." Walking through the settlement in the cold light of day was an entirely different nightmare. Women stopped whatever they were doing, butchering pale, slug-like game, scrubbing clothes in rusted barrels, patching leather, and stared. Nobody spoke. The silence was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I kept my head down, focusing on the muddy heels of Harper's boots as she led me toward a massive concrete bunker at the edge of the rushing river. Water roared, drowning out the unsettling quiet of the camp. The hydro facility was a relic, a brutalist concrete shell cracking under the relentless assault of moisture and time. Inside, the noise was deafening. A massive cylindrical turbine dominated the space, vibrating violently enough to rattle my teeth in my skull. Smells of burning ozone, pulverized metal, and hot grease choked the air. Harper led me to the primary access catwalk. I leaned over the rusted railing, looking down at the massive central drive shaft. I didn't need diagnostic tools to see the problem. I could feel it. The vibration was erratic, a harsh, grinding shudder that translated through the metal grating straight into my boots. "Shut it down!" I yelled over the roar, pointing to a massive manual lever on the control console. Harper frowned, shaking her head. "If we shut it down, the perimeter fences die. The crawlers in the swamp will breach the walls. If you don't shut it down, that primary bearing is going to shatter into 1,000 pieces of shrapnel and tear this housing apart," I roared back, my throat tearing from the effort. "You'll have a bomb, not a generator. Shut it down. 10 minutes. That's all I need." She hesitated, locking eyes with her partner. Finally, she cursed under her breath and threw her weight against the heavy lever. The roaring whine pitched downward, descending into a heavy mechanical groan before sputtering into silence. The sudden quiet left my ears ringing. Emergency chemical lights snapped on, bathing the damp concrete walls in a sickly green glow. "Open the housing," I ordered, gesturing to the heavy access plates. I wasn't an alpha male. I wasn't a warrior. But in a room full of failing machines, I was a god. My hands stopped shaking. The fear that had been paralyzing my gut since the crash receded, replaced by the familiar, comforting geometry of mechanical engineering. They hauled the heavy steel plates away. I leaned in. The heat rolling off the core was blistering, smelling of charred carbon. The main bearing was a nightmare. The housing was warped, the lubricating seal blown out, and the spherical rollers were ground down to jagged chunks of metal. They had tried packing it with animal fat to keep it lubricated. It was a miracle the whole thing hadn't seized weeks ago. "Pass me that spanner," I said, pointing to the heavy bag. "And I need a wedge, something to lift the primary shaft, just a fraction." For the next 10 minutes I worked. It was agonizing. My dislocated shoulder protested every movement, sending fresh waves of nausea rolling through my stomach. I had to use Harper and her partner as leverage, directing them where to push and pull while I dug out the destroyed bearing ring. blood from my scraped knuckles mixed with the black grease, smearing across the steel. "You have a spare?" I gasped, wiping sweat from my eyes with a filthy forearm. The shorter woman nodded, pulling a heavy, canvas-wrapped ring from a nearby crate. It was old, slightly pitted with rust, but structurally sound. "Clean it, fast." We jammed the new bearing into place, reseating the heavy drive shaft. It was a crude, ugly fix. Back in the orbital shipyards, I would have been fired for such sloppy work. Here, it was a miracle. "Lock it down," I rasped, stepping back. My chest heaved, my ribs burning with every breath. "Fire it up." Harper threw the lever. The machinery groaned, hesitating for a terrifying second before the water flow caught the blades. The shaft spun. The grinding shriek was gone. The violent, erratic shaking faded into a deep, steady, powerful purr. The overhead incandescent bulbs flickered, then burned with a solid, unyielding yellow light. Harper stared at the spinning shaft, then slowly turned to look at me. The awe in her face wasn't the terrifying lust of the hunters. It was reverence. Pure, unadulterated reverence. "You fixed it," she whispered, raising a grease-stained hand to her mouth. "Yeah," I breathed, leaning heavily against the railing. "I fixed it." Before I could enjoy the small victory, the heavy blast doors to the facility groaned open. Chloe stood in the doorway, flanked by 4 of her hunters. The glow of the newly restored lights caught the jagged edges of their glass-tipped spears. "Morgan says your time is up," Chloe sneered, her eyes raking over my sweaty, grease-covered body. "The pet needs to go back to its cage." The pride vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, heavy dread of my reality. I was a mechanic for a brief, fleeting moment. Now, I was just prey again. Grease stained my fingernails, a comforting, familiar black crescent beneath my bruised skin. Back in the cold, windowless clinic room, I sat on the lumpy mattress, staring at my hands. The steady, even hum of the electricity vibrating through the floorboards was the only proof that my morning had actually happened. I had earned myself a temporary reprieve. Morgan understood utility. As long as I was fixing her dying colony, she wouldn't throw me to the wolves. But machines eventually got fixed. The backlog of broken tech would end, and when it did, the biological debt she expected me to pay would come due. The outer door clanked open. Footsteps approached, but they lacked Morgan's heavy, authoritative limp. The inner door unlocked, and Harper stepped inside. She didn't carry a spear or a rifle. She carried a metal basin of steaming water, a rough cloth, and a fresh tray of food. "Morgan allowed this," Harper said quietly, setting the items on the floor. "You smell like the sump pits." "Thanks," I muttered, moving off the bed. My joints popped in protest. Harper didn't leave. She stood by the reinforced door, watching as I dipped the rag into the hot water. The heat felt incredibly good against my battered skin. I wiped the thick black grease from my face and neck, wincing as the rough cloth dragged over the bruises on my chest. "Why didn't you just let it explode?" she asked suddenly. Her voice was low, barely audible over the hum of the lights. I paused, rag hovering over my shoulder. "What?" "The turbine," she clarified, taking a half step forward. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, avoiding my bare chest. "You knew it was going to detonate. You could have walked out, let it blow, and used the chaos to run. The perimeter would have fallen. You could have escaped into the swamp." "I would have died in the swamp," I replied dryly, tossing the dirty rag into the basin. And hundreds of you would have died in the explosion, or from whatever crawled through the broken fences. I'm not a murderer, Harper. She finally looked up, her expression unreadable. My great-grandmother told stories about the men before the Blight. She said they were selfish, violent, that they took everything and left us to rot when the corporate shuttles abandoned Kepler. She said the Rust Blight was the planet cleansing itself of a parasite. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Corporate execs are parasites, sure, but the rest of us, we're just trying to survive, just like you. I pulled my torn, filthy flight jacket back over my shoulders, shivering as the damp material clung to my skin. Tell me about the Blight. Why didn't it affect the women? Harper crossed her arms, leaning her heavy shoulders against the doorframe. It was a synthetic pathogen, a mining Terra virus designed to break down dense heavy metals in the crust. Something mutated in the atmospheric scrubbers. It bonded with the Y chromosome. It didn't just kill the men. It dissolved them from the inside out. Heavy metal toxicity. Total organ failure. Within 3 months, every male on the planet was dead. A cold sweat broke out across my back. And me? I'm breathing the same air. The virus burned itself out 70 years ago, Harper said quickly, sensing my rising panic. No heavy metals left to feed on in the upper atmosphere. You are safe, from the air, at least. She didn't need to elaborate on what wasn't safe. We used the corporate gene vaults, she continued, her voice hollowing out, carrying the weight of a century of grief. Artificial insemination. We rationed the stock, tried to balance the genetic lines, but the power fluctuations degraded the samples. The last successful birth was 3 years ago. The child was stillborn. A mutation. Harper looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see a captor. I saw a terrified mechanic holding together a sinking ship with duct tape and prayers. You are our ghost, Arthur, she whispered, a myth walking around in a broken flight suit. Before I could answer, a loud, heavy thud echoed from the front of the clinic. The building shook. Harper spun around, her hand dropping to a heavy wrench on her belt. Stay here. Another crash, louder this time. The sound of metal groaning. Voices erupted outside, muffled by the concrete walls, but unmistakable in their fury. It was a chorus of shouting, screaming, and the undeniable clatter of kinetic rifles being racked. I moved to the barred window of the inner door, peering down the short hallway. Morgan is at the northern perimeter, a voice shrieked outside. I recognized the raw, grating tone immediately. It was Chloe. The mothers have hoarded enough. The bloodline belongs to the hunters. Open the door, Sadie. Sadie's voice was remarkably calm, though tight with strain. Back away, Chloe. Morgan left strict orders. Morgan is old. Morgan's womb is dust, Chloe roared. Something heavy smashed against the exterior reinforced door, bending the metal inward with a sickening shriek. Give us the mail! Harper backed down the hallway toward my cell, her wrench raised. She looked over her shoulder at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, primal panic. The fragile connection we had just built evaporated, replaced by the chaotic reality of the colony. Lock the inner door, she hissed at me, fumbling with her key ring. Harper, wait, I shouted, grabbing the bars. The heavy exterior door didn't hold. With a screech of tearing metal, the hinges blew outward. A wave of cold air and screaming women flooded into the clinic's triage room. Sadie was knocked to the floor instantly, Overwhelmed by a surge of bodies, Chloe stood in the wreckage of the doorway, her spear raised, her face painted with fresh mud and what looked like blood. Her eyes locked onto me through the bars of my cell. The feral, starving hunger was back, multiplied by 100. I stumbled backward into the center of my cell, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my bruised ribs. The wolves were in the house, and I was the only meal on the table. Screams echoed in the narrow corridor, raw and deafening. They weren't battle cries born of courage. They were shrieks of sheer, starving desperation. I stumbled backward into the far corner of my cell, my spine hitting the freezing concrete. My hands scrambled blindly over the floor, fingers closing around the edge of the dented metal tray that had held my dinner. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all I had. Harper didn't retreat. She stood her ground in the short hallway, her feet planted wide, the heavy iron wrench raised above her head. "Back off!" Harper bellowed, her voice cracking under the strain. "Morgan's orders! You breach this room, and she'll hang you from the turbine tower." Chloe spat on the floor. Her blonde hair was matted with dried mud, and her eyes were terrifyingly wide, the pupils blown out. She didn't look at Harper. She was looking right through the iron bars at me. Her chest heaved. I could smell the mob pouring in behind her, a suffocating wave of wet leather, unwashed skin, and feral adrenaline. "Morgan is old," Chloe hissed, her voice vibrating with manic energy. "She keeps the meat locked up while the tribe starves. Get out of the way, grease monkey." "No," Harper said, tightening her grip. Chloe lunged. She didn't use the spear point. She swung the heavy wooden shaft like a baseball bat. Harper ducked, bringing the wrench up to block. The impact rang out like a gunshot, sending a violent shudder through Harper's arms. But there were simply too many of them. Two more hunters surged past Chloe, slamming their weight into Harper. She went down hard, the back of her head bouncing off the linoleum floor with a sickening thud. They didn't kill her, but they kicked the wrench away and pinned her down, stepping over her writhing body. Chloe stepped up to the bars of my cell. We were inches apart. I could see the dirt packed beneath her fingernails, the jagged, uneven edge of her front teeth, the dilated, feverish hunger in her pale eyes. She grabbed the iron bars. Her knuckles turned stark white. "Mine," she whispered. The word carried no affection. It was pure, predatory ownership. "Don't do this," I croaked. My voice betrayed me. It wasn't steady or commanding. It was high, thin, and shaking. I held the metal tray up like a shield. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently I thought my chest might crack open. Chloe laughed. It was a jagged, ugly sound. She reached into her belt and pulled out a heavy, rusted pry bar. She jammed the flattened end into the locking mechanism of the sliding cell door. "Pull!" she screamed over her shoulder. 3 hunters grabbed the bar with her. They planted their heavy boots against the concrete wall and pulled. The metal groaned. A high-pitched, agonizing squeal of failing steel filled the room. I watched, paralyzed, as the reinforced lock housing began to warp. The thick bolts holding it to the concrete wall shifted, sending a shower of gray dust raining down onto the floor. They were tearing the cage apart with sheer brute force. "Stop!" I yelled, throwing the heavy metal tray at the bars. It clanged harmlessly against the iron and clattered to the floor. "You're going to kill me! If you all drag me out there, I'll die!" "You'll die breeding," Chloe grunted, her face turning purple with exertion. "A good death." With a final ear-splitting crack, the locking mechanism shattered. Heavy metal shrapnel pinged against the walls. The sliding door rolled open an inch, then stuck on the warped track. Chloe dropped the pry bar and shoved her hands into the gap, pulling the heavy grate back. It screeched in protest, opening just wide enough for a person to slip through. She stepped into the cell. I scrambled away, but there was nowhere to go. I hit the back corner, sliding down the wall until my knees hit my chest. Chloe grabbed me by the collar of my torn flight suit. Her strength was monstrous. She hauled me to my feet, her free hand violently grabbing the front of my shirt, ripping the fragile fabric straight down the middle. Her skin was hot, feverish. She slammed me against the concrete. The impact knocked the wind out of my bruised ribs, leaving me gasping, black spots dancing in my vision. Hands reached through the gap in the door, clawing at my sleeves, my hair, trying to pull me toward the hallway. "Got him!" Chloe shrieked triumphantly, burying her face into the crook of my neck, inhaling my scent like a drowning woman finding oxygen. Then the world exploded. A deafening concussive boom ripped through the clinic, vibrating straight into my teeth. It wasn't the dull crack of a kinetic rifle. It was the sharp, unmistakable thunder of old-world chemical ballistics. Real gunpowder. The hands clawing at my arms vanished. Chloe froze, her grip on my collar loosening just enough for me to drag in a ragged, panicked breath. "Move away from the cell," a voice boomed. It was raspy, deep, and utterly devoid of mercy. Chloe slowly turned her head. Through the gap in the door, I could see the triage room. Morgan stood in the wreckage of the breached entryway. She was holding a massive, heavy-bore revolver, the barrel still smoking. Behind her stood 6 women in heavy scrap metal armor, aiming auto rifles directly at the mob. "He belongs to the tribe," Chloe snarled, though she didn't let go of me. "You hoard him. You let us rot." Morgan didn't argue. She didn't debate theology or sociology. She simply raised the heavy revolver, leveled it directly at Chloe's center of mass, and cocked the hammer. The mechanical click echoed loudly in the sudden, terrified silence of the room. "I will put a slug through your spine, Chloe," Morgan said. Her face was a mask of cold iron. "You will not die. You will live in the mud, dragging your dead legs behind you, watching the rest of us rebuild. Step away from the male." Chloe's jaw trembled. Her eyes darted from the smoking barrel of the gun to the armed guards, then finally back to me. The feral light in her eyes flickered, replaced by cold, bitter reality. She let go of my collar, shoving me hard against the wall in her retreat, and squeezed back through the broken door. "You can't guard him forever," Chloe spat. "I won't have to," Morgan replied calmly. "Take your hunters. Go to the southern marsh. Do not return until you have meat. If I see your face in the settlement before tomorrow night, I will shoot you on sight." The mob dissolved, slinking past Morgan's guards like beaten dogs. They left behind the stench of sweat and the terrifying realization that my metal cage was nowhere near strong enough to keep me alive. Silence settled over the clinic, heavy and thick with the smell of discharged gunpowder. I slid down the concrete wall until I was sitting on the floor, my hands shaking so violently I couldn't pull the torn halves of my jacket together. My left shoulder throbbed with a sickening rhythmic heat. Every breath tasted like copper and fear. In the hallway, Sadie was kneeling beside Harper, pressing a sterile cloth to the back of the mechanic's bleeding head. Harper groaned, batting Sadie's hands away as she tried to sit up. Morgan walked slowly to the door of my cell. She looked at the shattered locking mechanism, the bent iron bars, and the scattered, jagged pieces of shrapnel on the floor. She didn't look at me. She simply holstered her heavy revolver, the leather of her belt creaking in the quiet room. "She was right," I rasped. My voice sounded hollow, belonging to a ghost. "You can't guard me forever. They tore through steel like paper." Morgan sighed, a weary, rattling sound that made her look suddenly every bit of her 60-odd years. She pulled the folding chair from the corner of the hallway, set it in front of my broken cell door, and sat down. "The hunger is a madness," Morgan said quietly. "It bypasses logic. They look at you and their biology screams at them to act. A century of denial, Arthur. You are holding back an ocean with a sieve." "I fixed your turbine," I muttered, wrapping my arms around my knees, trying to stop the tremors in my hands. "I stabilized your grid. Doesn't that count for anything?" Morgan leveled her cold, ice-blue eyes at me. "It counts for me. It counts for Harper. But you cannot plug a broken heart with a wrench. The tribe does not want electricity. They want a future. They want children. If I do not give them what they want, they will burn this settlement to the ground, slaughter my guards, and then they will tear you apart in the ashes." Panic flared in my chest again, hot and suffocating. "I'm one man, Morgan. You said it yourself. If you throw me into those tents, I'll be dead in a week. They'll kill me, or they'll kill each other over me." "I know," she replied simply. "So what's the plan?" I demanded, my fear morphing into a cynical, desperate anger. "You just keep moving me to stronger cages until they figure out how to build a bomb?" Morgan leaned forward, resting her heavy, scarred hands on her knees. "We need a compromise, a system that pacifies the tribe but keeps you breathing. The old ways, the way the mothers did it before the gene vaults ran dry." I frowned, my exhausted brain struggling to catch up. I looked past Morgan, out into the hallway where Sadie had finally managed to get Harper to her feet. Sadie was staring at me, her face pale, her lips pressed into a tight, grim line. "Artificial insemination," Sadie said from the hallway, her voice barely louder than a whisper. The words hit me like a physical blow. The absolute, clinical detachment of it. The sheer, dystopian horror of what they were suggesting. "We still have the extraction equipment," Sadie continued, stepping into the light of the hallway. "It's ancient. It hasn't been used since the last viable vials degraded 20 years ago. But the centrifuges and the sterile storage cylinders are still in the sub-basement." I stared at her, my stomach twisting into a tight, nauseating knot. You want to put me in a lab. I want to keep you alive," Morgan corrected harshly. "If Sadie can process the material, we control the distribution. We take the choice away from the hunters. We hold a lottery. We rebuild the bloodlines methodically. It removes the frenzy. It turns you from a piece of meat into a utility." I laughed. I couldn't stop myself. It was a broken, hysterical sound that bounced off the concrete walls. A utility, right, from mechanic to biological dispenser. That's a hell of a promotion. "It is survival," Morgan snapped, slamming her fist against the iron bars. The metal rang, cutting my laughter short. "You are not in a corporate hub world anymore, Arthur. You do not have rights. You do not have agency. You have biology and a heartbeat. And right now, both of those belong to me. You will cooperate, or I will let Chloe have you." I closed my eyes, pressing the back of my head against the cold wall. My cynical outer shell cracked, exposing the raw, terrified human underneath. I thought of my life before the crash. The quiet hours calibrating comms arrays, drinking synthesized coffee, complaining about the recycled air on the station. It felt like a dream. This smelling of blood, rust, and desperation was reality now. The equipment, I said slowly, opening my eyes. Sadie said it hasn't been used in 20 years. Yes, Sadie nodded hesitantly. Then it's broken, I stated, leaning forward, my engineering instincts kicking in as a desperate defense mechanism. Rubber seals rot, motors seize, centrifuge bearings degrade in damp environments. If you put me on a machine that hasn't been calibrated in 2 decades, you're going to damage the samples. Or worse, you'll cause a biological infection. You'll ruin your own stock. Morgan narrowed her eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying you need me to fix the machines first, I replied, my voice steadying. I was negotiating for my life, using the only currency I had left. You move me to the sub-basement. You give me tools. You let me rebuild the extraction tech. Ensure the sterile field generators are actually working. I won't just be your donor. I'll be your chief engineer. I maintain the grid. I maintain the lab. Morgan studied my face for a long, suffocating minute. She was calculating the risk, weighing my usefulness against the impatience of her starving tribe. You rebuild the machines, Morgan finally agreed, under Sadie's watch, but you will provide the first sample by the end of the week. If you fail, or if you sabotage the equipment. I won't, I interrupted quietly. I want to live, Morgan. I really just want to live. Morgan stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the concrete. Then welcome to the tribe, Arthur. Sadie, prep the basement. We move him tonight. As Morgan walked away, leaving me alone with the shattered door and my dark new reality, I realized the horrible truth. I wasn't just surviving the feral women of Kepler anymore. I was going to become the foundation of their entire world, one sterile, terrifying vial at a time. Dust fell from the ceiling in a fine gray mist as we descended the concrete stairwell. My boots slipped on the damp, algae-slicked steps. Sadie walked ahead of me, a heavy battery-powered lantern swinging from her fist, casting long, erratic shadows against the cinder-block walls. Behind me, 2 of Morgan's heavily armored guards brought up the rear, their kinetic rifles clicking rhythmically against their breastplates. I was a VIP, and I was a prisoner on death row. The sub-basement smelled of bleach, stagnant water, and ancient, crumbling foam insulation. When Sadie threw the heavy breaker switch on the wall, rows of recessed fluorescent tubes flickered violently before buzzing into a sickly, pale white life. My new kingdom was a graveyard. Row upon row of rusted steel tables filled the vast room. Broken centrifuge machines, shattered glass vials, and decades-old biohazard bins sat covered in thick layers of grime. In the center of the room, elevated on a small tiled platform, was the extraction array. It looked less like medical equipment and more like an instrument of torture from a forgotten medieval epoch. Thick leather straps hung limply from a heavy, reclined medical chair. Above it, a mechanical arm holding a series of intricate, dried-out pneumatic tubes and synthetic sheaths drooped like a dead metallic spider. "This is it," Sadie said, setting her lantern on a nearby metal tray. Her voice echoed off the concrete. The last time it was powered on, I was a child. The motor seized, and we didn't have the spare parts or the power to fix them. The remaining viable samples were lost to thermal degradation 3 days later. I walked slowly toward the platform, my boots crunching on broken glass. I ran a hand over the main control console. The metal was freezing. The buttons were stiff, fused in place by decades of humidity. "You want me to rebuild this," I murmured, staring at the thick rubber tubing. The rubber cracked under the lightest pressure from my thumb. "Sadie, this isn't just broken, it's fossilized. The pneumatic seals are dry rotted. The centrifuge bearings are likely fused. If I try to run power through this primary conduit, it'll short out and fry the entire motherboard." "Can you fix it or not, Arthur?" Sadie asked. She stepped up onto the platform, standing close enough that I could smell the sharp, astringent scent of the surgical scrub she had used to wash her hands. Her eyes were desperate. I looked at the machine. Then I looked down at my hands. They were bruised, scraped, and permanently stained with hydroturbine grease. I was an engineer. I fixed things. It was the only thing holding my fractured sanity together. "I need synthetic rubber," I listed off, my voice dropping into a flat, professional cadence. "I need solvent. I need a soldering kit, wire strippers, and about 3 pounds of copper filament. And I need those guards to go away. I can't think with them breathing down my neck." Sadie nodded to the guards. They hesitated, but eventually backed up the stairs, taking up positions behind the heavy blast doors. We were alone. For the next 3 days, the sub-basement became my entire world. I fell into a manic rhythm, driven by the pure, adrenaline-fueled instinct to survive. I tore the ancient machine down to its screws. I scraped rusted gunk out of the centrifuge housing with a pocket knife. I spliced new copper wiring into the burnt-out motherboard, using a scavenged battery pack to power my soldering iron. Sadie was always there. She handed me tools, wiped the sweat from my forehead when my hands were occupied, and fed me hot, salty broth from a thermos. A strange, quiet intimacy grew between us in that cold room. It wasn't romantic. It was the trauma-bonded connection of two mechanics trying to stop a bomb from detonating. I realized Sadie didn't want this any more than I did. She was a scientist forced to play the role of a grim reaper for her own species' dignity. On the evening of the 3rd day, my dislocated shoulder was throbbing with a dull, sickening ache. I tightened the last bolt on the primary pneumatic housing. I had fabricated new seals using boiled animal leather and synthetic resin. It was a Frankenstein's monster of a machine, ugly and scarred, but it was structurally sound. "Clear the array," I rasped, wiping my grease-stained hands on my ruined flight pants. Sadie stepped back. She held her breath. I reached out and flipped the primary toggle. Power surged from the grid I had fixed days ago. The console lit up, a cascade of green and amber lights cutting through the gloom. The centrifuge hummed to life, a low, smooth vibration that settled deep into my chest. The pneumatic arm twitched, hissed, and locked into its operational position. It worked. I stood there, listening to the mechanical heartbeat of the machine. I had done it. I had proven my worth. I had secured my safety from Chloe and the mob. But as I looked at the heavy leather straps hanging from the medical chair, a cold, heavy stone dropped into my stomach. The victory tasted like ash. I hadn't built an escape pod. I had built my own tether. I was the engine that kept the lights on, and I was the fuel that would keep this dying world alive. I stepped back, leaning against a cold concrete pillar, closing my eyes as the machine whirred in the dark. I was safe. I was trapped. And my real nightmare was only just beginning. Survival on Kepler didn't mean fighting off monsters. It meant becoming the very foundation of a dying world. I traded my freedom for a heartbeat, chaining myself to a rusted machine to keep the wolves at bay. If my descent into this grim, desperate colony kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with anyone who loves dark, grounded sci-fi survival stories. What would you have done in my boots? Fix the machine or take your chances in the swamp?